Scaling a business isn't all glossy headlines and overnight success. It's messy, it's tough, and it's full of lessons no one warns you about. I'm Nikki Jupp, founder of Talent Gateway. I've helped over 100 scale-ups build the right team, enabling them to grow with confidence. This is Scaling Stories Unfiltered, where founders, CEOs, and scale-up leaders share what really happens behind the scenes. No fluff, no filter, just honest conversations to help you scale smarter. Let's get into it.
Competition validates the marketplace.
Yeah.
You should be more worried if you don't see competitors than if you do. Hiring people for a growth stage business is very difficult to get right and fraught with pitfalls. The early stage business is a one-man band, but by the time you get to sort of your raising, you're a garage band basically. You're a few mates and you've got some skills and what have you. If you hire somebody from an orchestra, they're not gonna fit immediately.
On today's episode of Scaling Stories Unfiltered, I'm delighted to be joined by Jon Cornwell, CEO and co-founder of Newsflare, one of the world's leading video marketplace platforms. From the social video you browse on your phone to the clip shows and documentaries you watch on TV, it's likely that Newsflare played a role in sourcing that content, then published by the world's media. Jon has spent over a decade leading the growth of Newsflare into a global platform that serves social publishers, advertising agencies, news agencies, and TV production companies in over 60 countries. Along the way, he successfully navigated the challenges of raising VC funding to fuel growth, scaling a marketplace business, and staying ahead in the fast-moving media landscape. Before founding Newsflare, Jon built a strong foundation in leadership and strategy through consulting and executive roles at companies like dunnhumby and Ernst & Young. In this conversation, we'll dive into the realities of raising VC funding, the tough lessons of scaling a platform business, and what it really takes to succeed in a constantly evolving industry. Jon, welcome to Scaling Stories.
Thank you, Nikki. Absolute pleasure to be here.
Good. So let's dive in, Jon. I think it's always helpful if you can share a little bit about what got you to where you are today.
So I guess the whistle-stop story of my career is I left university not really knowing what I wanted to do, like a lot of people. My first job was working with the Crown Jewellers, Asbury Garrard, on what was actually sort of a re-ticketing exercise as part of a merchandise systems implementation. And it was there, just through dint of circumstance, that I stumbled into a role leading 22 people at the tender age of 23.
Oh, wow.
That was about management consulting. Ernst & Young were the integrator, and they suggested that maybe I want to consider management consultancy as a career route. So that led to 5.5 years at Ernst & Young, where I learnt a raft of skills, but something in there sort of didn't quite gel for me. It wasn't sort of my natural home.
Yeah.
And then my next move was to dunnhumby, the pioneers of customer insight.
Yeah.
Club card focus, and I learned the dark art of customer insight, customer segmentation, and how that powers a customer-centric business at scale. That was an exciting ride for a couple of years. Learned a lot, saw a new way of doing things, and then the next natural stage for me was to want to go and do something like that for myself. Myself and a colleague went and started a business that combined the customer insight of dunnhumby with the change management of Ernst & Young. And we built a global business that was about just over 4 million in revenues in about 5 years.
Good going.
But we had a mantra, which is that workshops are tiring. And I had an opportunity to get out with some money at the tender age of, I think it was about 33. And I took it, and I had all sorts of plans to do a ski season and maybe learn to sail well enough to do a transatlantic or all these things that you promise yourself. And I met a guy in a pub who had an idea that video, actually smartphones in general, so all of the media that comes from them, was going to change the way that news was reported. There's a guy called Bevan Thomas, who's my co-founder. And over a period of about, I guess, 5 months, probably from first meeting through the exit of my previous company, I didn't go skiing. I didn't sail across the Atlantic. And I thought, and it's a decision-making framework I've learned that others use, but my sort of thoughts at the time were, if I look back from the future and I haven't done this, am I more likely to have regret or relief or pleasure? And I'm going to regret this. All the conditions were there. Smartphones were rolling out at pace. Mobile data speeds were getting faster. And YouTube was about the only place that you saw a volume of video online, but video online was pretty surely going to be a thing.
Yeah.
And that was the inception of Newsflare.
Fantastic. So let's dive into Newsflare, the baby that you have now. And describe for me sort of the very early days. What's it like getting something off the ground? What were some of the big wins, some of the early, what did you learn from those?
Yeah, I mean, we're probably more of a teenager now, more rather than a baby. There's still growth and there's still sort of maturing to do. But in those early years, I think the early wins are forming a team. So looking left and right and seeing people with complementary skills that you don't have, that you can see are critical to the mission. My co-founder and I brought very different things to the party. We very quickly found a head of tech. And then we sort of went about building a platform. And we took about 9 months to do that. And then we read a book called The Lean Startup by a guy called Eric Ries, which at the time was one of the kind of the seminal works on sort of startup methodology, and realized that we've been doing a lot of it wrong. We've been building something from an idea in our heads, from post-it notes on my co-founder's wall, and actually we should have been building it around a customer use case. But with something built, we started to generate some data and we started to iterate. And so I remember the day we turned off the blog because we realized that we weren't really a blogging site. We turned on other features that worked. And then probably the first big pivot was we went from seeing our challenge as building an army of reporters and then telling them what to shoot, to finding great video assets that were already out there and pitching them to global news agencies like AP and Reuters, or national news desks like the Mail Online and the Telegraph. And there we started to find the first sweet spot of something that had enough revenue potential for us to take a margin. And then we were like, right, now how do we scale this?
And so you saw that market opportunity. How long before you felt the need? Because obviously when you're growing a business, not scaling at this point, there is a choice, a decision that co-founders need to make. Do we continue as we are and grow steady? Or do we go for it and look to expand quickly and scale and make that decision as to whether we get some external funding? So take me through the thought process that you went through.
Yeah, so my previous business was a consulting model primarily. And whilst I was there, we didn't take any external funding in 5 years. We were able to grow that business organically through only hiring people when we needed to, and then supplementing with contractors when we had projects. With Newsflare being a platform business, the sort of the capital intensive part of that is building the platform. I look back and look at how little money we spent on getting the beta platform live, which has evolved into what we have today. So it did scale, and I still scratch my head at how we did it. We borrowed, stole, didn't really steal, but open source code and here, there, and everywhere. We worked extremely hard, but there comes a point where you can see that the opportunity is bigger than the capability that you've got. Yeah. We weren't drawing salaries. We wanted to get to a point where we were at least drawing something. So we did the sort of the SCIS round.
Yeah.
We initially thought we were going to take 125,000. We then realized that we needed a bit more. The limit was 150. To this day, I still don't know why we didn't take 150. We took 140. But that's how naive we were, like genuinely. We didn't know what SCIS was. And now, this is 2012. So we're learning about all these tax breaks and finding that there were business angels out there looking for businesses like ours. We got very lucky with our first round investors. It was led by a guy called Derek Jones, who still sits on our board and has been a supporter throughout. And I think we probably didn't realize going into that first round of investment, how important having an experienced business leader, someone that run and built their own company, was to kind of providing reassurance, guidance, introductions, and just moral support for three young guys at that point, working their socks off to try and make something happen. And then that was kind of pre-revenue based on team and the product that worked. We could demonstrate. We had an app, we had a web platform, it worked, and it was really quite a punt for Derek at that time. And then about a year later, we were in revenue and it was scaling, and we raised off the back of scaling revenue another 300,000 in an EIS round. And that saw us through from really late 2013, early 2014, all the way through to November 2016. And by that point, your original question, what led you to take that first institutional round? We were looking around, we were seeing competition in the marketplace. And, when you're early in a business and you see competition, a lot of entrepreneurs' reaction is to panic and go, oh no, somebody else has had my idea. And actually, the truth is that competition validates the marketplace, and you should be more worried if you don't see competitors than if you do. And we recognized that better funded competitors were going to outdo us. There were lots of things that we needed money for, not just tech development, marketing, more proven sales team, a whole bunch of things. And so we geared up for an institutional round. I think it took me about 18 months in the end to kind of figure out how it worked with VC. I changed broker halfway through, recognized that offering a broker a really small slither was going to put you on the edge of their desk rather than the middle of their desk. That was an early lesson. If you find a good broker, make sure that a good result, a win, is going to be meaningful for them too. And then in November 2016, we closed our first institutional round with Edge Investments, around a 2.4 million.
Wow. So what a journey.
Yeah, it's been interesting. You asked about sort of difficult moments and stuff. I do remember before we closed the second round in just early 2014, a friend of mine invested, and he said that his accountant needed a screenshot of the bank account statement or the bank balance on screen just to prove deployment of funds for money laundering and what have you. And I said, sure. So I took a screenshot, redacted the various different bits, but neglected to redact the balance, which was something like 41p. And he wrote back, very funny. Clearly, that's not your only bank account. I said, you're right. We do have another bank account. That one has £3.70 in it. And he said, what were you going to do at the end of the month if money hadn't started to come in from this investment round? And I said, well, we'd have taken the team down the pub. It would have been a tricky conversation. We would have scratched our heads and had a think. And he said, how do you live like that? I said, well, I haven't got to live like that anymore for a little while because you've invested and the rest of the investment's coming and what have you. But we got that close to the wire a few times in those early days.
And I think that takes a certain kind of, I don't know what the word is, I'll ask you what you think the word is, or words to describe the kind of individual you have to be able to do that.
I don't know. I think we're all much more resilient than we realise, everybody. And I think once you've been through a couple of those things, you don't choose to get to a point where you've only got some total of just over £4 in the collective bank accounts. But when it does happen and you make decisions, because you can always make a decision, you can always do something, and you don't just survive it, but you go on to thrive after having survived it, you kind of put that in your pocket for next time something challenging comes up. And then you accumulate these experiences, and that experience builds resilience, that things are often seem a lot worse than they are, that there's always something you can do as long as you focus and concentrate on what you need to do. So I don't know if it's a certain type of person. I think there's a false comfort in employment in a big company. And we talked before, actually, another conversation we had about whether somebody's vulnerable or whether somebody feels vulnerable. And I think you might not feel vulnerable in a big company, but you are, because somebody else is making those decisions. And I think in a startup, there's kind of a raw viscerality to it that there's a strength in being the person that makes those decisions, and whatever vulnerability there is or isn't, you can see it very clearly and
Yeah.
you can do something about it.
Yeah. Yeah, we've chatted a few times about that, haven't we? And having worked in and as a view in those larger organisations, I think that's a really good point. The fact that you do feel you're safe, this is a steady business, but in actual fact it isn't, because someone's taking that, like you say, that decision making away from you. I think it's quite interesting. But also, I would sort of observe that the startup to scale up, let's call it that sort of transition, I would say you were at when you took that sort of, certainly the 2.4, you were around what size team?
I think we were about 15 people at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it takes a certain kind of appetite, I think, and this is worth chatting about. When you're hiring people, again, this is a conversation we've had, often when people get a slug of money, it's great we can go out. Obviously, if the plan has got, we need people in that plan and it's not majority tech, people get dazzled by a large brand. That's not to poo what they've done, but it isn't necessarily relevant in that stage of a business's growth. Talk about your experience around, I know there is no one type, but anything that you can sort of share around that topic.
Yeah, I think hiring people for a growth stage business is very difficult to get right and fraught with pitfalls. And I think the pitfalls are, it's a bit like kind of what feels like success versus what's actually going to contribute towards success. So hiring somebody with, I don't know, young on the CV or another big tech company where they've been successful and they're clearly really accomplished, you see that success and you think, well, I quite fancy some of that success within my organization. I think it would be good to have somebody that's clearly good at what they do. On the surface, the role looks the same. It could be product management, could be sales, could be a whole bunch of things. And then when you actually kind of unbox the layer down in terms of what they're going to be doing day to day, in terms of what they're going to have to suffer and endure in a smaller organization. So, for instance, a salesperson from a big organization might be PRs and marketing, and that it's more like an orchestra, and maybe they're the brass section or whatever, but it's got strings to back them up, and they've got percussion. The early stage business is a one-man band, but by the time you get to sort of you're a garage band, basically. You're a few mates and you've got some skills and what have you. But if you hire somebody from an orchestra, they're not gonna fit immediately, both culturally in terms of how chaotic and disorganized it might feel from time to time. Great scale-up teams thrive on ultra communication. They understand they need to put processes in place and they work to do that, but they also can cope with a lack of process on the fly. And sometimes people from big organizations don't like that. And I think the sales one, it's kind of, in a scale up, you need to have people that are confident and happy in building their funnel, and that they don't see parts of their role as a retrograde step in their career. I'm very proud of our business, and my team are too. So we think it's a great honor to come and work with us. And you think if you offer someone the right salary and that they're going to just grab it with both hands and be as enthusiastic as you are. But then if they're having to do things that they didn't do maybe in their career for the last 10 years that they've now got to do again, even if they say that they're happy to do that, they may not be. And I think also in a scale-up business, every business that's growing, it doesn't follow that you achieve product market fit and then it's static and you just scale, particularly in an industry like media, but it's not just the media sector. There are huge changes that need you to constantly go back and revisit product market fit. And that, again, is a skill that sometimes sales operatives from big commercial organizations, they're not used to. Having to question whether the proposition needs changing, tweaking, pricing needs adjusting. Whereas people that were involved right at the beginning, kind of that's second nature to them.
Yeah. It's so interesting. And what about, well, again, we've touched on this, but I think this is worth sharing. We used a word, or you came up with a description. Was it humble smart?
Oh, humbly brave. Yes.
Humbly brave. Tell me a little bit about that, because I loved it.
Yeah. Well, I think the best teams are where people do things, try things. Newsflare, we love the old mantra of seek forgiveness, not permission. Don't overthink it. Don't worry about how it's going to make you look. Just get on and do it. And if it doesn't work, well, at least we've learned that doesn't work. There's with good intent, there's very little really bad stuff that somebody can do by trying something. And I think that the humble bit comes in from if you set out with an expectation that it might work, but it might not, and I don't have all the answers, you're more likely to actually try it and see whether your plan survives contact with the enemy, whether customers engage with it in the way that you hope they might, whether actually that message resonates with that particular segment. So yeah, I think the most successful people in a business that's tightening product market fit, that's still figuring itself out, are those that want to try stuff, but also are quite comfortable being wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think
That's actually, that's something I've learned.
Yes,
as well.
I was going to ask that actually.
Yeah. Now, I'm not someone that naturally used to like being wrong, but I recognise in businesses that prosper and grow and scale that's a muscle that's shared across the founders and their teams. Is that
yes,
you come to recognise that as a strength. Getting comfortable with failure is something I talk about. It's a part of the journey to success, and avoiding that feeling of being wrong, that feeling of failure, actually retards your progress towards success. It's counterintuitive, but I think we talked before, Tiger Woods talks about what he's trying to do in his golf swing, and his coach talks to him about what the swing feels like. And they recognize that there's a difference between what they're actually doing and what it feels like. And they get comfortable with what it should feel like, because that's what you relate to most closely. And I think get comfortable with failure, because ultimately it will lead to success.
Yeah, and I think you need to feel comfortable I use the word culture, I mean it in an organisational perspective, because I think when you come into a business, you need to literally feel that failing is okay. And I think that has to come from the top.
Yeah, it does. And I think when you hire, I don't know if it's a glib interview question, but it's one that's, tell me about the time that you failed and how you cope with it or how you responded. But if you hire people that were valedictorian or head of their year or first from university and leading salesperson at a blue chip company for this year or that year, you have to ask yourself, they're very comfortable with being top of the class, being the best. And then when you look around startup and scale up world, and you look at what those founders and people did previously, a lot of them dropped out of school. There's a very high index of dyslexia amongst founders of startup businesses. And my sort of creeping hypothesis is that these individuals are more comfortable with failure than people that were top of the class. And so they're more prepared to try stuff. They're less fazed when it goes wrong. They're more attuned to getting up and going again. And that is the path to figuring out businesses. MBAs who apply theory to business rather than repeated iterative action point to me of a business where an MBA has founded it and scaled it using frameworks from Harvard. They don't exist.
Yeah. Do you know what? I think that's really interesting, that bit about the university piece, because having experienced having a child myself who is at a really high performing university on paper, so this is where I get bold about just looking at the CV. And I like the story that's behind the CV. One might look at someone who's been to an Oxford or a Cambridge and, to your point, got a first or whatever and go, well, they've not had any knocks, have they? But I think that there's a whole process. I remember going to a talk about children who want to go on to these universities. And I think this is where we've got to be careful that we don't have bias one way or the other, and which why questioning and conversation with the individuals becomes important. Because to get into those places, for some, not all, but for some, they've gone from an environment, to your point, where they have always been top of the class. They probably banged it out of the park when it came to their GCSEs. Then they banged it out of the park when it came to their A-levels or baccalaureate or whatever it was that they did. Then they get into an environment where, whoa, hang on a minute, I am no longer top of the class. I am giving this everything that I've got and something isn't working. And they start to fail. And they then have to take feedback, iterate, and then go back at it again. So I think sometimes we fall into the trap of generalizing. And I think often I find when I talk to someone that we might work with and they say, I want this or I want that, it's, or why do you want that? And it's that constant challenge. Those kind of things sort of make me think. But I agree with your point, but obviously from a more personal perspective, having seen someone, again, I would have held quite a different view. But again, it's a view and it's a bias that I would have held. And I always like to to challenge on that side of things. So I think that's quite interesting.
It's a bias that I held too. I did all right at school. I got 3 A-levels and got a 2-1 from a decent university. So what do? And I went to a blue chip consultancy that only hired people with a 2-1 or above and all the rest of it. But I didn't love it. And I think that my journey of the last 12 years or so, with 13 years with Newsflare, has really opened my eyes to the power of different personality traits that aren't visible on a standard CV. And actually what can make the difference in a team and in a business isn't visible on a CV. And I've hired plenty of people from Oxbridge, and some of them have been really good, and some of them have made a difference, but a lot of them haven't. And they're very bright, but something was missing. And it was a different thing in every case. There's not. And then I look at the people that, and I think also for some people that have gone through school, an education system that hasn't rewarded the way that they're wired. And I think, but you know, my partner works in education, and she works with special educational needs. And she talks a lot about how mainstream education doesn't address a huge swathe of people.
Definitely.
If you're one of those people and you've been missed, as many have been over the years, and then you find yourself in a role in a business where you can contribute to success and experience success, it's hugely motivating. And I think sometimes those people are the people that do really well in startup and scale up businesses that give them a shot.
It's trying to get to them. It's trying to get to those individuals. And I know that you've done some work with Good Work where they will, I think they're a charity, aren't they? Where they they help support individuals who are harder to reach, whether that's because they fell out of the education system or something different. Because life is not equal. And we can try, for example, to say we advertise on this and we advertise on that, but for some they can't reach it. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to enable a wider cohort into the world of work.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think some of the commercial reality of this is that sometimes those individuals will take roles that are lower paid. And in the early days of Newsflare, when we really didn't have much money, am I embarrassed? Yeah, I'm probably a little bit embarrassed to say that we ran the very early stage business on interns before the law was changed. And I'm nervous saying this, but we paid them £10 a day. It was post global financial crisis. Yeah. There wasn't much work around. For the record, we weren't paying ourselves any salary at all. So it's not like we were kind of getting rich off their backs, but we were building a business. Some of those people have gone on to be I look at a couple of them on the BBC. They're BBC News correspondents now. Another one went on to work for Sky. They've gone on to do amazing things. And there was a real diversity of personality that came through there. And all that you really needed was to get on with your colleagues, have a bit of an eye for video, and saying to somebody that's 18, 19, do you want to work with digital video every day, was pretty much pushing on an open door. And it allowed us to meet a really broad range of personalities, some of whom went on to become employees and stayed with the business for 4, 5, 6 years. But I think the world of work and trying stuff out versus going and doing a 3-year degree. I was talking to somebody yesterday. I think unless you want to be a doctor or a lawyer or you know what you want to be, go and do some business or something for a year or two, and then decide whether you want to go and specialise in some more school.
I think the degree apprenticeship is another good route. You really, to your point earlier about an MBA, the theory, you might want to do a business degree. The theory is one thing. Really living it as you're learning is far more valuable. But there aren't enough of them. I'm getting work experience or an internship.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm at the point in my life now, age 50, where I'm just starting to think that an MBA might be interesting. Not that I've plateaued in what I'm learning running a business, definitely not. But I feel that I've got enough of that now that if I supplemented it with some learning, I get a lot more value from what I'd learned from an MBA than if I just did one straight after university with minimal experience in the workplace. I think the danger of it is that you miss so much of the nuance and the softer stuff around how organizations work, how team culture builds, what can damage team culture, and quite what a weapon that is through difficult times and difficult market that no framework is going to help you with, or no understanding of financial structures or what have you. You've got to live it, I think.
Yeah. I want to dig a little bit deeper on that. Damaged team culture. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Damaged team culture. Oh, wow. Let's think of a couple of ways that team culture can be damaged. So not hiring for culture is a classic mistake that I've probably made, not recently, but in the earlier stage of the business. Somebody looks amazing on paper, great track record, with a set of skills addressing an area that we're not quite mastering to the level that we know we need to. So you get extremely excited about bringing that individual in. They get through the interview process. Everyone else is extremely excited too, probably because they also recognize that we really need help in this area.
Yeah.
And then you start to get sort of the odd murmurings, or you see the odd sort of micro behavior that isn't quite on point with kind of how everybody else treats each other or treats externals. I love that interview test where they ask the driver that picks up the candidate from the airport how he treated them. How do people treat the serving staff in a restaurant?
Yeah.
All of those sorts of things. I think, hiring is one way that damages team culture. I think sort of distance. I think the pandemic, our culture suffered a little bit. We did all sorts of things to try and stay connected, but I don't think we did enough. I think I found out how people's pandemic really was after it had finished, rather than knowing how it was during it. So I think having enough together time, and we're sort of stumbling into the whole hybrid question. And then I think trust. So giving people the space and the trust to do their job, and giving them the right level of space to do that with the right level of direction. Culture dies if there's a manager that doesn't trust. Good people leave.
Agreed. So let's touch on sort of entering new countries. So I know that you expanded into the US. Tell me about that. I mean, why was that part of the strategy? Again, what are some of the challenges? What are some of the things that people need to be aware of that probably you didn't know? Because it was the first time, I'm guessing, that you've done that.
So Newsflare today serves about 57 different countries in the world. There are about 5 or 6 key markets. But being a digital product, which is brought to us over the internet and is delivered to our customer over the internet, there is no physical good. It's an entirely virtual product. And that's a business model that denotes itself well towards a global footprint. I think we get content from about 140 countries in the world. No, that's overstating it. About 107 last time I looked. So we did incorporate in the US in 2017, and we still operate in the US. We operate in LA and in New York. It's quite a thin team out there now for a couple of reasons. One, it's much more expensive to hire people in the US than it is elsewhere. We have a team in Bulgaria, we have a team in London. We've also got a team in Pakistan now. The US is a great market to serve. As an employment market, it's very expensive. And I'd sort of urge everybody to have a sort of really good think as to whether you really need to be there in order to serve that market, and whether you could serve it remotely. The world of remote workers just got so much better with improvements in video conferencing, with Zoom and Google Meets and the immediacy of Slack. We've been comfortable dealing with the sort of the 24-hour clock for quite a long time.
That was going to be one of my questions, actually.
Have we conquered the US? No. Is it still a really important part of our revenue? Yes. I think New York, for us now, where our priorities are in our various different markets, is more of a focus than Los Angeles. And I think my advice to anybody looking at the US is probably twofold. One, look for what I call kind of crossover people. And by that, I mean Brits that have made the move to the US successfully and can help orientate you around the various different sort of considerations around visiting and or living there. And the other is Americans that base themselves now in the UK, looking for UK businesses that they can engage the US based law firm or accountancy practice or whatever with. So that they were really important for us. And then the other is not to think about the US as one country. Just culturally, California and New York couldn't be more polar. I think it's like somebody from Hampstead versus somebody from Newcastle. They're so different. Somebody said to me once that dealing with people in California is trying to work out when yes, let's do brunch actually means no. Dealing with people from New York, everything starts with no, and it's getting a no to a yes, and that's a very good way of highlighting what it's like. You go to California, you think everybody's crushing it. They've all got white tea. They all get up. They're all taking supplements and they go hiking on the weekend. It's a fun place, but navigating business culture there is cutting through the spin. A polite word on it is challenging.
Interesting, really interesting, those, John. So thanks for that. So we've covered a fair amount in terms of sort of the business journey, and you've shared some really interesting insights there. Yeah. So let's talk more about you as a leader. How do you think that you have evolved? Look back at John, let's say at the beginning of Newsflare to you now. Well, what's changed?
Oh, wow. A lot. Yeah, I'm very conscious of my interactions now. It's kind of, I think as a leader, probably the most important thing isn't your output. It's important, you get your work done and what have you, but it's the quality of your interactions. And the analogy that I use, and I used to do a lot of kayaking, and without boring you with technical detail, when you put a paddle in the water, you think that you're pushing yourself forward. But actually, you're doing two things. You're pushing yourself forward, and to some extent, you're retarding your progress if you're already in motion.
Yeah.
And I think every interaction is like that paddle. And I think it's being super aware that if you're going to put the paddle in the water, that you are doing so positively, and it is nudging the individual, the organization forward in the right way, rather than retarding it. And I think the old adage of fear and anger give bad advice is that if you're aware that you're worried that somebody's behaving in a certain way, or you're frustrated with a behavior or what have you, is really to get a hold of that, recognize it yourself, and then think about how am I going to put the paddle in the water to have a positive movement forward here. And that's something that I think comes with maturity for all of us, right? Not just in running a business, but raising children and all those other things.
That's a wonderful analogy. Wonderful analogy, Jon. So anything that's sort of along that journey that's really sort of taking you back, giving you a knock, and how did you bounce back from that?
I mean, there have been so many, really. Revenue dropping, market changes, key team members deciding it's time to take the next stage in their career. all of those things are things that in the moment they feel like everything's cracking and
Yeah.
it's not building, is disintegrating. And the, back to that kind of what is happening and what it feels like, and separating those two things is really important. So it's kind of a senior colleague leaving because it's the right thing in their career or for their career, or because there are personal circumstances that make it the right thing for them to do. Really seeing that in their context rather than seeing it from what you want them to do for your organization is really important. And then I think then taking other members of the team on the journey that we survived before this person was here and will survive after they've left. And I think hiring great people, if you get them to stay 3 or more years, you've done quite well. If you get them to stay 5 years, you've done very well. And if you get them to stay 7 years, you've done phenomenally, because they're the people that are going to want fresh experiences and are going to want to use changing their environment as a tool for personal growth. So it's a double-edged sword. But I remember when our head of tech said, in the middle of a funding round in 2012, right at the beginning, and we were raising our EIS round, it wasn't 2012, it was in 2013, that they were moving on. And I had to persuade incoming investors that it wasn't a problem and that we had a plan, and that actually that build work had been done, and now the challenge was changing and we were recruiting a different type of professional to do that. The reality was that he had a personal circumstance that meant that he wanted to return home to New Zealand. But, so the team sort of changes is one. I think events, I think it's Boris said to us, events, dear boy. We had a defamation lawsuit against us in the middle of our most recent funding round in 2021. It was spurious. It was a guy who I think was trying to create a PR screen because he chose to sue us rather than Reuters or NBC, who'd also published a clip of him being arrested on the charge of kidnapping. But we had to defend that in the court of Los Angeles. So I went to a litigator that I used in the UK, a very good Kiwi lady called Victoria Macavides. If anybody's looking for a media litigator, Victoria's excellent. And then she found me a US litigator in Santa Monica. We informed the insurer. And then during the funding round, whilst managing that, we managed what's called an anti-slap motion and had it thrown out of the Los Angeles court.
Under pressure, funding round and going through that. Your nerves were sort of a little bit shot at that point.
Well, they were, but then you think, what do you do? So you start making decisions. Who am I going to pick up the phone to? You get some advice. You get a plan of action, and before you know it, it's kind of like, I've got some grown-ups in the room helping me.
Yeah.
Let's go.
And that weaves beautifully, actually, into my next sort of question. We're sort of winding towards the end. I've got a few more for you. You touched on it earlier. You talked about a gentleman called Derek. You've talked there about another contact that you've built over the years. What about the support systems that you've had around you, mentors or peer groups that you've been able to lean on, and the importance of those?
Yes, I think peer groups first. I'm sort of in touch with a whole range of people who've built their own businesses at various different stages. Some who are a bit earlier, some who are exited and had good exits, some that have had to wind up the businesses because they haven't worked for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And others that are a bit more like us, that are fighting the good fight, and variously at different times have had really challenging periods, and at other times, like we are at the moment, are kind of on the good foot and surging. I think knowing that you're not the only person that's going through it, whatever you're going through in life, is kind of a comfort. I think also it's a source of meaningful advice, because one of the things you find when you run a business is there's a queue of people giving you advice, and then you quickly learn that not all of it is that well informed. And I think people that have run a business and have scaled a business, possibly sold a business, not just successfully, but also those that have tried and haven't been successful, have a ton of experience that's really valuable. Mentors, I've had a mix of stuff. I have a very good chairman. I've sort of changed members of my board to bring in experience more recently. More recently, I brought a guy in from the US who sold a big company to a blue chip company on the NASDAQ in our sector, and Tom Crary, who sold Pond 5 to Shutterstock.
Yes.
3 years ago, coming up 3 years ago. And different advisors are better suited to work different stages in the journey. Improving margin and getting all of our financial mechanics right is one of the many strings in Tom's bow, and something that 5-6 years ago wasn't really what we needed to concentrate on. So timing of these, working out what you need at different stages, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But yeah, in terms of coaches and what have you, we've worked a couple of times. We work with various people, but the ones that stand out as being really excellent are an outfit called System. It used to be called Startup Core Strengths, run by a guy called Matt Lerner. Nupadon is his partner in crime. They run a really good program for companies really looking to establish / tighten product market fit / language market fit in terms of getting to market. And I think kind of understanding that cusp between sort of what people call startup, but I won't call it that. I'll call it establishing product market fit.
Yeah.
People associate with the startup stage, but actually needs to continually go on through a company's life, because if you don't pay attention to it, it can slip. Think of Kodak, think of Nokia. And then working out, all right, actually, we're now ready to put some energy into scale up because our product market fit is tight enough. That's a difficult thing for companies to gauge, knowing when to go back to product market fit. And folks like you, and I guess you need different advisors for different stages. But we've recently sort of gone back to System and been to one of their conferences. They ran a conference for the first time this year with Turing Fest, which was excellent. And we're doing much more work in that area again that we hadn't done for a few years. But yeah, so to different advisors and mentors for different stages of the business.
Yeah, thank you for that. Two final questions from me. I think you touched on it right at the beginning. You mentioned a book. You said the Lean Startup, which was one. But my question really is, are there any frameworks, habits and resources?
Frameworks, habits and resources. Yeah, sleep is a habit that I continue to work on. We have an 18-month-year-old, so much to the frustration of my other half.
What with that?
I am a self-sleeper. And that sounds a bit trite in this sort of era of wellness. But I personally think if there are all these routines where you get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and you exercise before you pray, and then you have your second breakfast. And I do think something simple that we can all do is really concentrate on getting a really good night's sleep.
Yeah.
I once worked with a guy whose wife was a classical singer, and he said that she slept 10 hours a night every night. And I was like, wow, that's really unusual. Why? And he said, the thing about being a classical singer is that you need to memorize massive scores of music, and that takes a lot of brain power, and quite a lot of them need a lot of sleep. And I was like, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, really interesting.
So the one habit I'd really advocate is really make sure that you don't scrimp on sleep. In the early days of the business, we worked crazy hours and we partied a bit too, actually, but that becomes unsustainable after a while. And you have to look out for that burnout potential, because it's very real. Frameworks.
Or books that you've read.
I've got one that I think is quite, I'll give you a book too. But the framework I would offer up, I think is really good, is Stop, Start, Continue. And I really think that there's so many elaborate frameworks, but the ones that are simplest to remember and that are so powerful, when you're looking at your role, your own role, or that of a report, and you're looking to manifest some kind of a shift, which is in line with what they want to do more of, running through what is you want to start doing, what do we need you to continue doing, and actually, in order to make room for what you're going to start doing, what do you need to stop doing, and then coming back to it. It's a powerful tool for sort of personal growth. Very simple.
Like that. And a book?
Yeah, I'm going to offer you Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. It's a book about negotiating. I've read it a couple of times now. I've had the feedback that I'm quite a good negotiator, which I'll take. I'm trying to be better in the process of trying to buy a house. And so I'm deploying a lot of it. I'm labeling emotions, which is one of the things that he advocates. This guy's a FBI hostage negotiator, retired. I think he's from Oregon.
Right.
And he has a voice like Christopher Walken. And his examples aren't, when I was negotiating the £5 billion deal with IBM, his examples are, so when I was negotiating with this guy that had 5 hostages in the Philippines, this is kind of how it went down. So the stakes are so much higher than a business deal. And he basically articulates a framework where he manages to stay calm, which is kind of remarkable given his situation, and also how he manages to empathize with the other side, which is kind of tricky when there's someone as abhorrent that's threatening to kill people they've taken hostage. It's a great book. There's a lot in it for people that want to get better at negotiating.
I shall be reading that.
It's very good.
And my final question, Jon, what's one myth about scaling that you'd like to bust?
One myth about scaling that I would like to bust. Probably referencing back to what we said earlier, that if you just hire, once you've got to a certain stage, if you just hire great people and leave them be to do the work, then the business will just scale on its own. There's been a lot on sort of LinkedIn and elsewhere about Brian Chesky's founder mode recently, which has resurfaced a lot of clips from Steve Jobs saying that he sort of made the mistake of hiring in smart people from big companies and then had to fire them all. We've had our sort of fair share of that. And I think the way to sort of, that is a myth at face value, and it needs to be caveated with, there are great people that have been in big companies that could do great things for your company, but you need to look below the surface and assess whether they really want to take on the reality of working in a smaller company without all of the processes and resources, and whether they've got the right outlook personally towards prospect of failure that's going to be conducive to success.
Wonderful. Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed that conversation, learned lots, and I'm confident that whoever listens to this, Jon, there are loads of golden nuggets peppered throughout that conversation. I really have enjoyed it. I think it's been awesome. So I want to say thank you, and I will make sure that your details, so people can take a look at Newsflare and the great work that you guys do. So big thank you from me for taking time out to sit with me today.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
So that's it for this episode of Scaling Stories Unfiltered. And if you enjoyed the conversation, don't forget to hit the subscribe and share it with someone who's on their own scaling journey. And I'd love to hear from you, whether you've got a question or a personal story to share, or even want to suggest a guest that we should interview. Just head over to the link in the description below. Your insights could be featured in one of our next episodes. In the meantime, why not check out some of our other interviews for some real unfiltered stories about scaling a business. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you on the next one.